There's this really famous video game called Fallout that starts with the now infamous quote, "War. War never changes." And honestly, seeing what's going on in the world right now, that quote is pretty spot on. But this is not a political channel, this is not a war channel, this is a science channel. And for a very long time, we always believed that this idea of war, or organized lethal conflict, was a kind of a uniquely human property, or I guess failure, uniquely human failure. Or basically something that humans seem to have been doing for as long as we've existed, but something that potentially does not apply to other animals. However, recent studies and recent discoveries challenge this idea, because it turns out that even some of our closest relatives, such as chimps, possibly go through this idea of war as well. And so the roots of collective violence potentially go much deeper than our own evolutionary past, and may involve something that's fundamentally biological and something that exists in many different species. But before we discuss this remarkable new study that just came out, let's actually go through some of the terminology first, because war, by definition, is not just some kind of a fight. Which is why many biologists usually avoid the idea of war when talking about animals, like for example these ants. And naturally, because for humans, war also involves a very complex socio-political practice that very often involves complex ideology, religion, or even just pure revenge. And as far as we know today, animals don't seem to actually have these features, and normally they fight for something a little bit more mundane: territory, food, and mates. In this case, in this really cool picture, they're actually fighting over a dead wasp. But that said, some researchers still argue that certain social animals do engage in something that resembles war, or at least resembles a kind of a sustained, organized, and very often lethal conflict involving two somewhat similar groups. And in some sense, this does fit our definition of warfare. Because in this case, we're not just talking about a simple fight between just two individuals, like right here. We're talking about two separate groups banding together to systematically eliminate a different group. And that's actually where this research gets somewhat interesting and, I guess, somewhat disturbing. And so let's start with the most famous example that was actually documented back in the 1970s. And this is officially known as the Gombe Chimp War. And so this is the most famous early study of this behavior that actually came from the late Jane Goodall, who unfortunately passed away not so long ago. And so here in the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, sometimes in the early 1970s, a single community of chimps known as the Kasakela started to splinter into two separate groups, with a new group of 6 males and 3 females moving to the southern part of the territory and forming what scientists started to refer to as the Kahama community. So essentially they formed two separate families. And originally, Jane Goodall believed that chimps were much nicer than humans, despite being our cousins. In other words, her initial impression was that chimps seemed to be a lot friendlier and did not display the same types of aggressions as humans did. Yet what followed basically shocked her. From 1974 to 1978, the Northern Kasakela group began a systematic campaign of violence against the Southern group. And here they did not just defend the borders, they literally sent out war bands to ambush isolated individuals in order to eliminate them. Now, unfortunately, I cannot show you any pictures of this, mostly because some of them were kind of gruesome, but here the brutality was unprecedented. One by one, all of the males of the southern group were eventually killed or disappeared completely, with researchers even observing the Kasakela males celebrating after these attacks. They usually did this by hooting and dragging the branches, performing movements resembling a kind of a dance. And so by 1978, at the end of this 4-year conflict, the Kahama community was completely eradicated. As a matter of fact, this was the first time ever scientists saw male chimps deliberately and systematically kill their own kind, which is of course when zoologists started to change their opinion about the peaceful chimp. It wasn't so peaceful after all. But it was really this recent study that takes this to a completely new level, because now researchers actually witnessed something we've literally never seen before outside of humans. This is from the lethal conflict after group fission in wild chimpanzees. And so let's, discuss this new study that's even more extreme. Now technically for decades, the Gombe War was potentially seen as a kind of an anomaly, perhaps caused by human interference or possibly the inclusion of feeding stations inside the park. In other words, some scientists actually believe that the chimps became aggressive because humans were there and interfered with their natural habitat. But this massive new study published in 2026, focusing on the Ngogo chimps in Uganda, definitively confirmed that these civil wars seem to be natural, despite being potentially rare in chimpanzee communities. Now you can read about the Ngogo Chimp project and even donate to it in the description below. But in essence here, this community was actually one of the largest chimp communities known to us, with approximately 200 individuals. This is roughly where it's located in Uganda. And for approximately 20 years, as they were studied, and in this case they were actually studied very passively without human interference, they were basically kind of peaceful and lived in these cohesive communities. Yet in 2015 something started to happen. Scientists started to notice a kind of a polarization in their social networks. Here you can actually see this visualized. And so basically they started to form two separate clusters. They were known as the Western and the Central clusters. And within just a few months they started to kind of avoid each other. At first it was very minor, but by 2018 the group has permanently fractured and formed two distinct communities. And so it actually just took a few years for this whole large family involving 200 individuals to create two separate communities. And just like before, what followed was a period of intense aggression. Between 2018 and 2024, the Western group carried out at least 24 attacks that killed at least 7 adult males and even 17 younger chimps from their former friends in the Central group, with at least a few of these attacks observed and documented by the scientists. And so once this split was finalized back in 2018, these former allies and friends became lethal enemies. And interestingly, it was actually the smaller Western group that started to attack the larger Central group. In other words, it was the smaller group that became more violent. As a matter of fact, in terms of numbers, the Western group was outnumbered by 3-1. But they seemed to be more aggressive and even more successful in their attacks because of a much stronger internal cohesion and the much more frequent patrolling behavior, which of course was just a little bit unusual. But I guess the main question in this case is, so why exactly did they split? And why exactly did this violence start? Well, right now researchers are not entirely certain, but they have identified several destabilizing factors that possibly acted as a tipping point. First, massive group size. This is based on the assumption that there is a kind of an optimal number of individual members for each of the groups. And so this community may have reached this threshold where maintaining social bonds across all members became impossible. At the same time, around this time, there was actually a kind of a loss of key elder chimpanzees that seemed to be responsible for maintaining many of these social ties. Specifically, some of them died because of old age, and so the previous social bonds were kind of broken. Then, in 2017, there was an unusual respiratory epidemic that seemed to have killed several individuals that were also some of these critical connectors between the emerging factions. And lastly, there was a major alpha male challenge. The shift in leadership created a kind of a power vacuum and intensified local rivalries. And it was these rivalries that eventually became violent and even resulted in lethal outcomes. So definitely quite an interesting observation and quite an interesting study. But this is obviously important for other reasons. And that's because in humans we do often think that war starts because of some kind of a cultural difference. For example, religion, language, or ethnicity. But in this case, all of these Ngogo chimps were all of the same culture. As a matter of fact, they were friends for decades. And so here this suggests that sometimes war can be triggered simply by the breakdown of interpersonal relationships and various social networks. And especially when a group becomes way too large to maintain many of these ties. So ethnicity or political ideology is not actually required to bind groups in order to fuel hostility. And so the authors do propose a kind of a relational dynamics hypothesis that revolves around interpersonal ties. And so these local rivalries seem to be enough to ignite a lethal conflict. And so for us, as humans, this does suggest that the roots of human idea of war may also lie in these fundamental social behaviors that sometimes result in the breakdown of relationships that do not involve ideological differences. Or at least this is how it possibly started in prehistoric times. But obviously here, it might also be worth taking a look at some of the other species because this type of a conflict is also common in some of the other social animals as well. And so while chimps do show us the human-like side of war, the real kings of animal warfare are usually found right under our feet. And so once again, for example, ants. Ants do engage in wars that in terms of scale and organization seem to be remarkably similar to human conflict. As a matter of fact, some species like the slave-making ants actually raid the nests in order to steal the young. And these kidnapped ants are then brainwashed and raised to literally work for their captors. They become ant slaves. While other species even use a kind of a chemical weapon. They basically release various pheromones that tend to mimic the alarm sense and cause panic in their enemies, which is a type of an unusual chemical manipulation we don't actually see in a lot of species. And interestingly, in places like San Diego, a lot of different ant super colonies, usually involving Argentine ants, lock themselves in these massive battles that seem to last for months, where millions of individuals die every single month through this constant warfare. And strangely enough, some of these battles seem to be even ritualized. Colonies may have duels, or even meet in specific locations, in order to settle disputes. And usually they do this during the day, withdraw at night, and come back every single day. In other words, some colonies of ants seem to literally live in this constant warfare, kinda like, I guess, humans. And though except for ants, we've seen some other types of organized conflicts in, for example, lions and wolves, meerkats and mongooses, and even naked mole rats, in most cases this is actually just territorial disputes or disputes over resources. And so it's not really truly warfare, or at least a type of a lethal warfare that's now been officially observed in chimps. Which of course leaves us with this one important question. So what does this actually tell us about our own nature? Or basically, what is the takeaway from all of this? Well, first, it definitely tells us that collective violence is not some kind of a malfunction of human society, but does seem to be some kind of an evolutionary strategy that does appear across many different species when certain conditions are met. And though usually this involves competition over territory or resources, sometimes it also just involves a breakdown of ties or something that we don't even understand, like those unusual rituals in ants. Second, this of course highlights the importance of social relationships. The Ngogo study in particular suggests that the antidote to war might be maintaining those small daily acts of reconciliation and friendship that seems to keep community connected. And so when those ties break, the results seem to be a lethal conflict. Which is a kind of a serious reminder that, despite us being thinking animals, and of course chimps are as well, we still share this very deep and sometimes very dark biological trait that seems to be ingrained in a lot of different species on the planet. Or basically, war never changes after all, and it's not just a human thing. But because this is such an exciting research, we'll definitely come back and discuss the additional research and additional follow-ups in some of the future videos, which means that maybe subscribe. Until then, thank you for watching. Come back tomorrow to learn something else. Support this channel on Patreon, where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM it directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.